Hi there. Welcome to today's psychological flexibility Q&A session. Unfortunately, Ross wasn't able to join me today due to a scheduling conflict at the last minute due to his travels. So it's just me today, I'm afraid. And the way that we run these Q&A sessions is as simple as that. I do my best to answer your questions all about what we've covered on the podcast series to date, all of the psychological flexibility related skills. So please feel free to drop your questions into the chat. And as I say, I'll do my best to answer them. Quick reminder then of what we've covered so far. And this is a good test of my memory as well. We started this series by looking at what it means to be psychologically inflexible. Some of the ways that our thoughts and our behavior don't serve us well, and why that is. Why it is that we can be inflexible or psychologically rigid, perhaps. We looked at the benefits of cultivating what we call present moment awareness, being more present in this moment, rather than doing all of the mental time travel that we're wont to do. We've looked at the benefits of cultivating a more effective relationship with our thoughts. And collectively, these things are called cognitive diffusion, or just simply diffusion, being able to see our thoughts for what they are rather than what they say they are. And as I said on that episode, my coaching clients seem to get an incredible amount of benefit from practicing that, because if you've ever been prevented from getting to sleep by a recurring thought or a memory, you'll know the power that those thoughts can have over our experience in that moment. We also looked at how we can persist through discomfort and accept it as part of doing meaningful things, rather than get into the habit of trying to avoid or just minimize discomfort. I was in a session yesterday where someone asked a question about feedback as part of having conversations at work. I made the point that if your goal in providing feedback is to avoid discomfort, then there's a good chance you're going to avoid delivering effective and impactful feedback, because your focus is on your comfort rather than the accuracy of the feedback that you're giving. We've also spoken about the benefits of how these skills are mutually supporting. So it's not enough to just develop one or another, that actually it's very difficult to be present. It's very difficult, I should say, to practice diffusion with our skills if we're not present in the moment. It's very difficult to persist through discomfort if we haven't got an appreciation for what that is by using our diffusion skills. In other words, to be able to see discomfort for what it is, a temporary, non-dangerous, non-painful experience. So bringing these all together is how we're going to finish this series. We've got one more episode to drop, which is all about the role of our self-concept and how we think about ourselves. That's a huge part of our psychological flexibility, even if it is a little bit more difficult to pin down. And then we're going to do a final episode, which is a wrap up of everything that's been covered and an opportunity to answer all of the questions that have been sent in. And by way of reminder, you can email me your questions that I'll be able to answer on the podcast by sending an email to podcast@worklifepsych.com. I can anonymize those questions if that's helpful for you. Okay, I'm just seeing the first chat appear there. I'm loving the podcast. Thank you so much. That's a really short phrase, but it makes a big difference to us who sit in front of a microphone for a few hours each month to do it. So thank you. I find myself talking about ACT a lot with clients and my family and friends. One question I have is, do you find this sits with CBC, or does it conflict with the idea of changing thoughts? This is a really good question. So let's take a step back for the broader audience. ACT stands for acceptance and commitment therapy, if we're using it in therapeutic contexts. When I'm talking about it in the workplace, I generally refer to it as acceptance and commitment theory. It's a cohesive concept, which is a collection of skills that allow us to feel and experience psychological flexibility. So ACT represents the skills. Psychological flexibility is what we're trying to develop or grow, maintain, however you want to look at it. And CBC, cognitive behavioral coaching. So there's one way of looking at this, which is to say ACT is simply a third wave of cognitive behavioral theory or cognitive behavioral therapy. It's building on that. And as a practitioner, I've been trained in both. And I have used exercises from cognitive behavioral coaching with clients in ACT situations and with groups when I'm doing team sessions. A lot of the metaphors carry across, a lot of the exercises that people might do in order to better understand the nature of their thoughts and indeed their self-concept. They can work really well. I would point to the number one difference would be between what we do with those thoughts. In other words, and keeping it nice and simple, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral coaching does two things that we don't really do in ACT, to my mind. One is evaluate the thoughts as being good or bad. In other words, welcome or unwelcome. And therefore, unwelcome or bad needs changing. And that's the second point. It's about changing that thought, replacing it with a better thought. And that it doesn't work. I mean, really fundamentally, it doesn't hang around for very long, that change. And it involves an awful lot of effort. And so instead of trying to change the nature of the thoughts within our attempts to grow our psychological flexibility, what we're learning to do is just to see them as thoughts and pay less attention to them. We don't see them as good or bad, but we see them as, in context, either helpful or unhelpful. And if they're helpful, we use them. And if they're unhelpful, we move on to the next thing. That's keeping it simple. But that is the main difference. I would suggest that we're not going to waste any of our limited resources trying to make a change to that thought when it's just a thought. Instead, we can use our cognitive diffusion skills to get some distance from it, to see it, just as a passing mental experience, to take some of the sting out of it by potentially labeling it or any of the other techniques we might do, to free ourselves from it so that we can be in this moment and dedicate our resources to whatever's in front of us, whether it's, I'm pointing at devices here, whether it's a document or whether it's a person or whether it's a TV show, whatever it is that we want to be doing. And, without making this too complex, the way I explain this, because this is a frequently asked question, whether people realize it or not, they're asking this same question. When we struggle with thoughts, our minds are not like a neatly organized filing cabinet where we can take one thing out and replace it with something else. It's much more like a network. And what we're doing by saying, this is the bad thought and I must replace it with the good thought, effectively, we're making a stronger connection between them in that network. And so therefore, when we think the good thought, we reactivate the bad thought. And I'm using those terms very, very loosely, being ACT appropriate. We don't have good or bad thoughts. We just have thoughts that in context are helpful or unhelpful. And I think also, I mentioned cognitive diffusion being something that my clients find so powerful. I know Ross, my co-host on this series, would echo that, and a lot of other practitioners would as well. And I think it's because our busy minds take us away from the moment that we're in, not to go daydreaming as such, and not to relax or be calm, but to try and problem solve something that hasn't got an answer. Immediately before pressing start on this session, I was working on a course I'm developing around psychological flexibility. Now, this is a bit of public accountability. Now you know it exists. But I was working on some wording around the fact that we have a very problem-solving mind. And when we notice a thought, image, memory, all of that stuff, all that mental stuff, when we notice it and we don't like it, our mind presents that as a problem. And we need to work on that problem until it's solved. But my very rhetorical question is, how do you solve a memory? Anything that we do to work on that memory could really be a waste of our resources, unless we're going back in our mind to learn from our experience and to bring that experience to bear on the present moment. But that's intentional reflection. That's not the kind of grabby, sticky thought stuff that can go on that takes us away from the present moment. A super long answer, but I wanted to give it justice. That is actually is one of the big differences between the two, cognitive behavioral coaching and act-based coaching. I don't necessarily see them in conflict, but what I will say is that what the evidence says is that ACT gets us longer lasting results, particularly in the clinical space for conditions like anxiety and depression. It gets us a much longer lasting, sustainable impact for the individual. Follow-up question. So when exploring self-talk, would you also avoid talking about positive or negative self-talk as it feels evaluative? Absolutely. There's a word that doesn't really exist in English, or not as I've encountered it. People, ACT practitioners, talk about the workability of something, the workability of our behavior, for example. Does that work out, for you? And this is a great way of exploring what we do, because in the very short term, something might work for us. In other words, avoidance can work for us because we don't experience the discomfort and we get some instant relief. But does it really work for us over the medium to long term? If we're honest with ourselves, no, it doesn't. So workability, when we talk about our self-talk, it's about how helpful it is to either buy into that self-talk, how helpful that self-talk can be in different contexts, because we also want to avoid kind of rule building. There's enough rules in the world and enough in our mind. We don't need to create any rules. So therefore, we could say that sometimes our self-talk can be helpful in a given context. And sometimes the exact same self-talk could be really unhelpful in a different context. And what this does is help our clients give enough attention to what their self-talk sounds like and pays enough attention to the context they're in to be able to make a judgment as to whether this is something that needs more attention or whether it's something they can just let pass. And they don't need to take their guidance on how they behave, what they do, what they don't do from that self-talk. This can help us sort of slide back into the trap that's very appealing of, I must never say that to myself. Because what we're then saying is, that's a very powerful phrase that has a lot of power over me, rather than, that's just a thought. It's just another thought. And there will be another one and another one. You've heard me say this before, I'm sure. We're not short on thoughts. There's no shortage of them. So if we're able to see self-talk as just another form of thinking, we move away from the evaluation of whether it's good or bad, but we could put a label on it that's not evaluative. And that's a big part of practicing cognitive diffusion. In other words, being able to see something that we notice in our mind as being a memory. That's simply a memory of the past. We're not saying it's good or bad. It's a memory. So it's not happening right now. Something about the future, particularly a scary future, we might say that is a prediction. Neither good nor bad, but that is a thought about the future. It's a prediction. It's not about what's happening right now. And the more we're able to apply these labels to those mental experiences, the more distance we get from them, helpful distance, and the less, whatever form they take, the less likely it is that they'll pull our attention away from the present moment. The less likely it is that we'll get caught up in them and be struggling with them. And I just want to reiterate that when we talk about ACT in the workplace, we're talking about the everyday hassles that can make life more difficult, that can lead us to procrastinate, that can lead us to hold ourselves back from really positive opportunities, that can prevent us from speaking up when it's important, or that can lead us to find it difficult to say no and find ourselves overwhelmed. The root of all of this stuff is in our thinking and in how we appraise situations. So what we're trying to do is build in a flexibility of response to situations that's not rule-based, but is more about the context. Again, we're not going to always say no, never say yes. It's about what's going on for you. How much work have you got on? Who is this person? What is the nature of the task? Is it possible? So mapping this onto our everyday experience of work is really, really important, because while ACT has therapeutic roots, it is as impactful and almost a immunization for future mental health challenges. If we practice this, we're far less likely to find ourselves in a situation where we have to put our hand up and say, I need more help from a clinical perspective. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with putting our hand up and asking for help. It would be great if more people did that. But it would also be good, given the resources that are out there, if more people had the skills so they avoided that situation in the first place. And there's an awful lot of received wisdom in the world about our minds, about psychology, full stop. But one of them, and it may be to what you're referring here, is about thinking positively and talking to yourself positively as being a good thing to do, which implies having bad thoughts or bad self-talk or negative self-talk is something that must be avoided. Now, negative self-talk could take the form of being justifiably and accurately self-critical. I got that wrong. I made a mistake. I've had a bad impact on my colleague, and this is how I can make amends. That's not bigging yourself up. That's admitting you're fallible. But the toxic side of that would be to only focus on positivity. And often that's not realistic. And the implication is think good, feel good. And what we're definitely not doing using the ACT framework is chasing good feelings or happiness or emphasizing the absence of discomfort. This, I would have to say, is possibly the number one frustration people experience when they start to put this stuff into practice. What do you mean the discomfort isn't leaving? Well, it's not, because it's maybe inherent to the task, but what you're doing is paying less attention to it and you're getting more involved in doing, persisting, you're taking helpful action, you're speaking up, speaking out, putting your hand up, whatever it is. The discomfort is not going anywhere, because as soon as our efforts are put into minimizing or removing that, we're no longer focused on what's important. So that's why I'm a little bit critical of the, think positive thoughts soundbite, because there's a big part of our well-being that is about acknowledging challenges and being realistic about challenges and not just trying to think ourselves out of a situation. In fact, you could argue that thinking strategies by way of coping can often work against us. If we're just not taking action, but we're trying to think ourselves out of a problem, then we're not going to get very far with that. I hope that makes sense. I'm jumping around quite a bit, but I appreciate the questions. Please keep them coming. If they're not questions and they're comments, or they may be examples of things that you are taking from this series and putting into practice, or reflections on how you are putting this into practice. Again, I've just been writing about how to build up these habits for the course I'm creating. And one of the things I cover in workshops is the importance of, the phrase I use anyway, is looking for the spaces in between. What I mean by this is the spaces between activities where there is an absence of activity. You're waiting on something. You're waiting for the kettle to boil. You're waiting for the shower to heat up. You're waiting for the microwave to go ping. You're waiting on a train, a bus. You're between meetings. You're whatever it is. There are these little slices of time where otherwise we might pick up our mobile. We might stare into the middle distance. We might think of what's on our shopping list. These represent an excellent opportunity to practice present moment awareness or diffusion, or to just simply practice noticing what our mind is giving us while we're not active, while we're not actively involved in something out of interest. Isn't it interesting? My mind is giving me these memories. Isn't it interesting? My mind is giving me these thoughts about the meeting later on. Isn't it helpful? My mind is giving me this reminder that I didn't actually write down anywhere. So these very brief moments, little and often, is how we can put these skills into practice. And it's the absolute opposite of what many people might think. I go on this course, I need to block out hours for practice. No, I think that's the opposite. That can feel very anxiety inducing, a little bit overwhelming. So it's about short, momentary experiences of these, building it up over time, noticing the positive difference it makes. Then it becomes habitual. Then it's a way of dealing with the world, rather than don't sit in the corner and do an hour of noticing your thoughts. I don't know anyone that could do that, if I'm honest. So if there's anything you'd like me to try and revisit, during this time, let me know, or anything that's left you feeling a little bit vague about the how would I do that? That's a consistent question I ask in workshops. If you can't visualize yourself doing this, that's a great opportunity to ask me a clarifying question. I would make the very important distinction when it comes to this or any other skill set, the big distinction between knowing and doing. There's an awful lot of stuff we can know and understand. It doesn't mean we're going to put it into practice. So it's absolutely critical when it comes to psychological flexibility that we're putting the things into practice, not with the expectation of instant results, but putting them into practice so they become a practice. And we reflect and notice, how does it feel to do that if it's quite different to what we've done before? There's a real risk, especially for smart people who like to learn, capable thinkers. There's a real risk that they get to understand all of this. It can be intellectually stimulating. It can be conceptually interesting, but they fail to put it into practice. So that would be a big message for me, finding those little spaces in between in our demanding schedules that I'm sure so many people have. I know so many people have, finding that little space and putting it into practice, because we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for practice. We're looking for attempts and getting better over time. I'm not seeing any more questions appear in the chat. I'm really happy to continue to, as if by magic. One of my client bases is parents who are parenting in challenging circumstances, many of which are navigating complex support systems with various barriers to access. I'm finding that values as guides and cognitive diffusion are really helpful in helping parents work with the discomfort and thoughts around what it means to be a good parent, social norms, etc., and self-blame. Although your podcast is about the workplace, it has reached far beyond, not a question, just a thought. Thank you for that. As I say, I've just been writing about this, and one of the things I wrote this morning was about ACT being skills for life. Yes, in the context which I work, it's about empowering people to use this stuff in the workplace, but almost invariably, people will give feedback that they're also using it in their personal lives. You're the same person. So you get clear on your values, they're your values. You don't have work values and home values. You have values. And then you notice the benefit of living those values, whatever the context is. And once people develop the capacity to be more mindfully focused at work, they realize just how much time travel and autopilot they do outside of work. And then they have that skill that if they wish to, they can turn it on when they are with friends, down the pub, at the gym, with the family, whatever it is. So they're immensely transferable skills. And so that's really, really powerful. Thank you for sharing that, because values as a concept and as a skill set, they really do help us when the circumstances around us are challenging. They really do help us derive a sense of purpose and meaning and avoid hanging our self-worth on something as simple as a fleeting thought that's just gone through our minds, or one piece of feedback, or one setback, or one disappointment. So I'm delighted to hear that it's useful. And also, it doesn't surprise me, because there's great evidence to show that ACT works, has a really positive impact, not just in the clinical sphere, but in educational. I met some great practitioners who use it in social work in Canada at a conference a couple of years back. And they're using it for those kinds of scenarios where actually it's a very complex thing. It's not like me sitting down with someone who's talking about their procrastination at work, complex, systemic, challenging issues. And yet these skills, however they're communicated and taught and however they're put into practice, help people to see beyond labels that have been applied to them and help them persist through difficulties, because they know what really matters to them. Rather than being told this, they're getting it for themselves. Really nice. Thank you. And that label, good parent, that's actually one that comes up in workshops for me a lot. When I explore the downside of how we interact with our self-concept. A lot of the time, our self-concept consists of labels that are oversimplified or out of date. And what that means is we're either chasing for situations and experiences that support that label in a very simplified way, or we're using the label as an excuse for not doing something. And most importantly, we might be viewing it in binary terms, good, bad, present, absent, whatever it is. A parent, it's a big role for people, the major role in their lives. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of pretty harsh self-evaluation on something like that. And in the workplace, the equivalent would be, I got feedback on my timekeeping, therefore I'm a bad employee. The inability for so many of us to see beyond a rigid good, bad self-concept into something that's much more nuanced and sensitive to context, where you could say, I got feedback about my timekeeping. That's something for me to improve. But I'm still a great person and I've still got lots going for me. And in fact, I have the self-awareness to know that it's something I should have worked on before. And I've got the wherewithal to improve my timekeeping. It's a very different response to critical feedback equals bad me. But I normally ask groups to pause and think about the labels they apply to themselves and indeed how they introduce themselves to people. And that gives them a really good insight to see how flexible or inflexible they are when it comes to viewing themselves, and how so many of those labels or roles, if you like, are being interpreted in an evaluative way. In other words, I'm a good X, I'm a bad X. And that takes up a lot of our headspace. It really does. It's a constant hum of attention being given to that. Whereas it's quite intangible. It doesn't need to have that much of our attention. And in fact, it's taking away from our capacity to do the behavior, the action that would support living that role, occupying that role and doing a good job of that role. So it's quite an insidious mental mechanism, and one that the parent one is one I hear a lot. Similar, manager, leader, people often focus on those as being a good, bad dichotomy, whereas as we take a step back and just think about it, much more complex than that. I hope these rambles are filling in a few blanks for you, and maybe elaborating. It's one of the reasons that we schedule these sessions, just to have a chance to deviate slightly, link things up as well, because each episode is about a different topic, but being able to link things up and put them in context can often help with our broader understanding of it. So I hope we're managing to do that. Another question there. Thank you for this. Do you think people who are skilled, reflective thinkers struggle with this less helpful self-evaluation because of the tendency to do so what thinking that is perhaps desirable in other contexts? I'd love to see this explored in schools/education alongside critical thinking skills to prevent those becoming a tool for self-criticism. Yeah, I don't know. Well, one, I don't know that there's evidence about that skilled reflective thinkers struggling with self-evaluation, but I know that it can take different forms for different people, for sure. For some, it's almost a mantra-like self-defeating belief that has been absorbed at some point earlier in life, often in school. Yep. A stray or careless phrase from a teacher is embedded and it stays with them, or overly harsh or unfair feedback from a manager stays with them, or just what they might refer to as a life lesson is embedded, like something as overly inflexible and simplistic as people can't be trusted. You know, that's like a mantra. So learning, I would overwhelmingly be an advocate of teaching these kinds of thinking skills in school, to allow kids to be able to see that the stuff their mind gives them is not necessarily true or helpful or accurate or any of the above, alongside critical thinking skills. I'm running a few events this year. In fact, I've had a couple of events already this year talking about evidence-based practice And one of the most important things, if we're going to be more of an evidence-based practitioner, no matter your domain, whether it's medicine, law, psychology, whatever it is, being an evidence-based practitioner is intrinsically linked with being a good critical thinker and critical reasoning. And so being able to see the thoughts for what they are and to think about your thinking and kind of metacognition, these are skills that I would much rather my mid-career coaching clients had picked up earlier, because it would have been better for them and they wouldn't have found themselves experiencing the difficulties that they do right now. I know I would have benefited from it, and it's enormous amounts. And I can think of many hours out of each week's curriculum that could have been stripped out from my education and had no negative impact on me, but replaced with something as beneficial as learning how to be psychologically flexible. I remain hopeful, though, that kids, young people will be exposed to it more and more. And there's a big literature, by which I mean accessible literature in bookshops, bringing ACT to life for children, teenagers, young people, translating it for them. Because that's one of the reasons I really like this whole area is its malleability, its flexibility, because the terminology can be adjusted depending on the audience. The order in which you do things can be and should be adjusted dependent on the context and the client in front of you. And therefore, you can translate it and use creative imagery and metaphors to bring it to life for somebody, and they can make it their own. So the more we can do that for different audiences, I think the better. The more these will be strange concepts that someone like me talks about, turning into something that is just understood in society because enough people have learned how to do it. So I hope that's going to be the case in educational settings. And I think even for younger people going through particularly challenging situations like university life, where that can be quite difficult in terms of the sheer volume of feedback you get, the uncertainty about what's going to happen after university, am I part of the group? Am I outside of the group? Social tensions. Psychological flexibility could help with all of these. I mean, I'd have it for everyone if it was possible. A bit of a fan of it, but it's one of the areas in my career where I've virtually stumbled across an entire area where not only is there a fantastic and compelling evidence base, but there's also a wonderful community of practitioners who quite literally want to give this away so that as many people as possible benefit from it. That's why we did the podcast. That's why I make the videos on YouTube. That's why we do sessions like this. And it is why I'm creating the course for later in the year for those people who do have the time and the resources and the drive and the wish to invest in themselves and take that time and effort. But as much as possible, it is about giving this away. Oh, where does ACT sit with positive psychology? That's a really good question. I know that sort of, again, keeping things nice and simple, positive psychology is, to a large part, an intentional research, exploration of the positive experiences in life to balance out the negative focus on, a couple hundred years of psychological research, which was all about the negative or unpleasant human experiences. So positive psychology focuses on happiness, joy, thriving, cultivating the life you want, positive emotions, positive experiences. I don't think there's an inherent tension with that. And, a whole drive behind ACT is to allow us to live the life that we really want to. And ACT is focused on helping you be the best version of you. I suppose what it doesn't do, and I'm thinking aloud here, so excuse me in advance for any inconsistencies, but I think what ACT intentionally doesn't do is emphasize positive emotions as a goal. ACT is about getting to where you want to be. And if that leads to happiness, fine. But happiness is not the goal, because emotions are very brief, volatile, They don't last. They're not consistent. They're not something that we can hold on to forever. But what I see as being the big overlap between the two is that positive psychology asks the questions about how we can make life better and how we can ensure that as many people as possible know how to do that for themselves. And I like that in a lot of the positive psychology literature I've encountered, and I'm by no means an expert, there is an emphasis on making small changes to your life to see what that does for you. And that's a big commonality with ACT. The habit focus, habits of looking for ways to express your values in the everyday versus major personal reinventions, which simply don't stick. So two sides to it. It's not about chasing positive emotions, but you could say ACT allows you to have more positive experiences. If those experiences are values aligned experiences, then they're welcomed experiences. But it does underline that when putting, for example, our values into action, it's not always going to feel good. Often it can feel quite challenging. It can feel anxiety inducing or worrisome because we're doing something that matters, but without the guarantee of success. But we're doing it because it matters to us. It's in line with who we want to be. So I don't see them in tension. I think they're different lenses to explore the human experience. And I think positive psychology, for a large part, has done a great job of maybe rebalancing that focus and helping us understand more about the sort of brighter side of our shared human experience. Okay. In the absence of any more questions, unless you're frantically typing, and that's one thing that I really don't like about Zoom. I can't tell if anyone's typing. There's no indication, but we'll give it another minute, and then I might suggest we wrap up for today. So please, don't ask any more questions. If you've had one at the front of your mind or manifesting on your lips, now is the time to ask. I'd encourage you. And otherwise, we'll wrap up for today and potentially see you this time next month for our final Q&A. And remember, we've got 2 episodes in the pipe that purely focus on psychological flexibility. My most recent episode was not part of that series, but it was good timing to put it out there. I had a great conversation with Dr. Rachel Skews, who's an expert in acceptance and commitment coaching, about the evidence base and turning theory into practice. So that and all the other of these episodes are available on my Pocket Psych. That's the podcast where you might have discovered this. You might have discovered this on People Soup, Ross's podcast. We've been publishing on both as a bit of an experiment. It is a collaboration. So they're going out at different times on the different podcasts and in different ways. He's editing them differently to how I am. But we've got a couple of episodes to come before the final 2 in our first steps in psychological flexibility. So I would love to have the final episode that we record, because we haven't recorded it yet. I would love to have that with as many of your questions as possible. So I'd encourage you over the next couple of weeks, please feel free to email me, podcast@worklifepsych.com, with anything you want to know about ACT, psychological flexibility, our practice, our training, the podcast series, and we'll answer all of those in that last session. We've already had some great questions in, but the more, the merrier. So don't be shy, send them in. We'd love to hear from you. And just to reiterate, thank you so much for listening and engaging with the series. We've had a fantastic time making it. We've really enjoyed it. But what really is the icing on the cake is to hear that people are both enjoying it, but more importantly, learning and then putting it into practice. And I've been lucky enough at a couple of conferences recently to meet peers who are listening to what we've created and have been really positive about it. And that was really lovely to hear. We love having chats, we love talking, but to know that our conversations are being enjoyed, that is just lovely. Okay, so no more questions have appeared. Thank you so much for joining me today. Look forward to hearing your other questions over the next few weeks and ending this series in the next couple of months. And please do keep in touch, because it's not the last time that we will be addressing any of the facets of psychological flexibility, either on the podcast or on the YouTube channel. So thanks for joining me today. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.